Hello, and welcome to session 2 of 6 of our Improving Implementation Learning Module series. Today, we're talking about implementing restrictive practices fade out as part of implementing the Comprehensive Behaviour Support Plan. Our rationale for this session is that restrictive practices placed on persons with a disability constitute an infringement on the human rights of the individual. Fading out restrictive practices requires significant planning and collaboration from all stakeholders. And our learning objective is that learners will understand key tasks involved in implementing restrictive practices fade out and the role in assigning timelines and time commitments to the process. So, just a review of what fade out actually looks like in terms of restrictive practices. This particular session deals with managing the implementation of these tasks, but these particular tasks here are covered in the proficient micro learning called Fade Out Management. And I encourage anybody, particularly leaders, to view that proficient micro learning to get an understanding of the key components of risk, stakeholder management, strategy development, and monitoring. It's important for all clinicians to recognise that the way the BSP is prepared gives an indication of what fade out needs to look like. So, if you're struggling to understand what fade out looks like in implementation, there are possibly gaps in the way it's indicated in the behaviour support plan. Recognise here that in terms of the 3.0 or 2024 template, these components specifically and explicitly link to your planning of fade out and will give you the guide to what that looks like. So, your consultation process and stakeholders, your other sources, the development of proactive strategies, obviously the restricted practice summary and protocol tables, and your implementation table, as well as medication purpose evidence, will give you directions as to how your subtasks need to look and what you're planning to have happen in the implementation stage. There are a number of key considerations when you're planning out how your fade out will look and how you're going to lay that out in the 12-month period of a behaviour support plan. First of all, it's important to remember that environmental changes usually need to be in place before you begin fading out a restrictive practice. So, that is to say, the environment for the person needs to be collaborative, conducive, and supportive of their needs so that the restrictive practice is less required. If you have a situation where you have multi environment restrictive practices, for example, a locked door at both home and in a day program, you need to coordinate that fade out for a mutual start date so that we don't have extinction burst or behaviour burst at one location or another. You need to time your data collection, your reporting, and your care team support in implementation with the fade out. So work out when your communication needs to occur. Is it prior to a particular change occurring, after a particular change occurring, or both? And this actually needs to be planned out prior so that each of the stakeholders are involved. You may find that when you plan out the implementation of your fade out, that sufficient funding is not available in the person's plan. So it's a good opportunity when you're planning implementation to request a change in circumstance or a funding review before the actual plan ends. It's also important to allow in your budgeting for adjustments in PROTA of the plan, so reviews and re-uploads for reauthorizations. Moving over to the bottom left, we can see that communication is really important in planning your implementation fade out. So planning for who you're going to communicate with and how, and making sure you've allocated enough plan time and your time to do that. One of the key issues or key barriers with fade out of restrictive practices is supports feeling uncertain about what the fade out will look like and uncertain about the increase in risk that occurs when a restrictive practice is removed. So making sure that you clearly communicate the plan and also the backup plans really helps with getting that stakeholder on board support. When you're planning out your timelines across the year, allow for a review, allow for reversal or adjustment. It may not be completely successful. There may be unforeseen barriers or changes, and sometimes restrictive practice fade out is unsuccessful completely and return to previous needs to occur. All of these things are absolutely expected, but we need to plan for that possibility. It can be important to recognise your pathways for a least restrictive or shortest possible transition through restrictive practices. So moving from a high risk restraint down to a low risk restraint, or reducing a routine restraint to a PRN or an episodic restraint. So case by case, you need to consider whether this is an option. You may also need to ensure that you have adequate non face to face time allocated across the life of the plan for resource development and protocol adjustment. The supporting documentation is as important to communicating with the stakeholders because it is the visible and delivered product of our work and ensures that consistency when we're working together. The next thing to do is to consider the subtasks in the fade out. We know that we have 5 categories of restrictive practice that are going to be applied to the person. Some people have a range of restraints applied. Some people have a number of high risk restraints applied, but most commonly, chemical restraint is part of the work that we do. You need to consider what the subtasks look like for the specific type of restraint, and noting here that these subtasks aren't exhaustive, but they give you a fairly good idea of what might be involved in achieving a particular fade out. We're going to deal with each of the restricted practice types individually and have a talk about what these can look like. So, in terms of chemical restraint, a couple of considerations when you're planning out your time frame. First of all, we know that chemical restraint is determined by the prescriber. Behavior support practitioners don't have a role in prescribing chemical restraint. However, we need to plan for the fade out based on the prescriber advice. We know that behavior changes can lag behind deprescription or they can build quickly. So, depending on the individual case by case circumstance, a person may demonstrate behaviours of risk or increase in risk very quickly as deprescription occurs, or there may be a latency period. Remember to allow for review through the process as mentioned before. So the fade out may be unsuccessful. And in situations where we've had a person who has used a particular chemical restraint for a very long period of time, there may be a situation where review has to go back to the doctor very quickly. At the outset of the fade out, plan for the monitoring process that you're going to use. Set that up so that all stakeholders know their requirements and their involvement. And as mentioned before, ensure that your environment, your skill building is in place to account for that fade out and to increase the ability of supports to meet the person's need without applying the restraint. In terms of budget consideration, it's probably important to recognise a lot of your time will be non face to face, or it could be based on care team meetings to analyse the data, communicate with prescribers, continue to adjust response strategies, and things like that. Um, It may be difficult at the time of the BSP to understand the prescriber's fade out timeline. You need to plan, but you need to expect change. More experienced clinicians probably have a better understanding of how this looks, but you can try and get as much information from the prescriber as you're writing the behaviour support plan so that you're actually planning this fade out as part of that comprehensive preparation. You need to ensure that there's adequate one to one time scheduled for your participant. Your participant must be informed of what the fade out looks like. They must have the opportunity to have input and they must be consulted and given choice and control wherever applicable and possible to ensure that they achieve that kind of ownership, person centeredness, and success. It can be a very big and daunting experience for something significant like a restraint to change for the person. Moving now to environmental restraint. It's important to think about the fact that when we have environmental restraints, we have structural adjustments, we have expenditure that can occur as part of that process. May need to fade out locks. We may need to change accessibility to particular parts of the house or the property. So these can actually create delays while we wait for those adjustments to be applied. Sometimes the support needs need to precede the fade out. So we shouldn't necessarily be waiting for builders to come into a house, for example, before we begin to start the fading out. So think about how supports can step in to increase the speed of that fade out occurring. For example, Locked doors or a locked fridge can be unlocked with an increase in one-to-one support because then it's unnecessary. There's someone there to support the person to meet their needs. As a behaviour support practitioner, it's worth emphasising the time for team communication and plan for that time. You need to have all supports agreeing and all supports really comfortable with the plan moving forward. And this happens particularly in multi location restraints where you have locked doors at a number of different participant environments. In terms of budget considerations, think about the budgets that are required for those multiple environment restraints. Do you have to create care team meetings with each facility? Can you do everybody together? What observations need to occur? What planning and support changes need to occur in each of the environments based on the fact that you'll often have several different support organisations involved? At the moment, the Quality and Safeguards Commission are focusing on multi-environment fade outs when we're talking environmental restraints. So multiple environmental restraints are a significant focus. Plan reviews might then favour change of situation or change of circumstances if needed. So consider whether this is going to be a requirement in order to fade out. Remember that fade out is the key focus of our work. And if we need to ask for the funding to support that, we've got a good case to do so. If we budget really well for preparing our documentation, our communication and training, we're more likely to see consistency, we're more likely to see buy-in from stakeholders, we're more likely to see success in achieving funding reviews. Remember that response strategies are significant in an environment fade out. In terms of mechanical restraints, when we think about timeframe considerations, you often require input from allied health, from other prescribers, occupational therapists, for example. You have to create that plan in conjunction with your allied healthcare team so that you're ensuring the intersection between therapeutic intervention and restrictive practice, and that you're ensuring that the mechanical assistance to the person is accurate and up to date. Fade out pathways are often really valuable in a mechanical fade out process, so you might want to plan a fade out pathway across the 12 months that reduces the frequency, reduces the use of a mechanical fade out from routine to episodic under a very specific set of circumstances. You may wish to look at a less restrictive mechanical restraint, but I think it's very important to seek the proper clinical advice, particularly for these high risk restraints. It's very likely that removal of a mechanical restraint needs significant environmental adjustments and usually significant support adjustments. So you will have a time lag there while you're bringing the right people aboard. Consider how that will look. Get the clinical support required for fade out. In terms of budget considerations, your restraint priority should be to either determine the therapeutic use or fade out with priority. We know that this is a high risk restraint and is particularly infringing upon the person's human rights. It may trigger the requirement for early plan review. Fade out pathways for high risk and complex restraints might require planning across more than one BSP. So you may move from a high risk restraint to a lower risk restraint. So it may be 2 to 4 years. That is still fade out because you are planning it consistently the way we're going to approach this to reduce the risk and increase the safety and rights for the person. It's important when you're delivering the BSP to get your key deliverables. So, what are the things that we want to do in the fade out pathway and when do these need to occur? And match them to your reporting so that you can get your budgets clear. In terms of physical fade out, physical restraints are a significant and high risk priority. So, when we're looking at multi restrictions upon a person, physical restraints probably need to be looked at in a sense of urgency for fade out or elimination. Consider whether the practice can be ceased instead of faded. How does this affect your timeframes? How does this affect the deliverables and the skill building that needs to occur? Obviously, ceasing a high risk restraint creates another set of considerations for the behaviour support practitioners in terms of ensuring the safety of the participant. Remember that physical restraints often need to be replaced with low arousal responses, and these take a lot of training and sometimes quite a significant mind shift in supports. Plan for this, and where necessary, seek funding support. There's a lot of complexity with family based physical restraint. And there's a lot of significant mindset shifts that need to occur there. You may need to plan for bringing a number of other stakeholders on board to support that particular process. In terms of budget considerations, at the publication of the BSP, think about whether you're going to need a plan review. Are you going to have the funding required in order to do this effectively? While we do have to fit in with an allocated budget, we also have a role to say, we believe that this approach for the person will require additional resourcing. And if we have the evidence to support ourselves, then we can seek that funding from the NDIA. Look at your budget apportionment. Look at response strategies, low arousal, and return to baseline support. And that helps with the fade out and creates a bit more speed behind it, but it can take significant time. This may take more time than the one to one support with the person themselves, particularly if you're finding that physical restraint is occurring frequently. Remember, again, budget for data collection and reporting. We want to make sure that we're seeing proof that the restrictive practice is ceasing and that alternative strategies are being put in place. And thinking about seclusion now. Seclusion is also a high risk restraint. It should be prioritised for fade out or ceased immediately. Seclusion is often related to staff choices when we're talking about staffed houses or supported accommodation. So it can be that extensive training in the early part of implementation can mean that seclusion is ceased rather than faded out very, very quickly. It's important to define your key deliverable dates for your data collection so that you can declare the effective cessation of this particular practice to PRODA. We want to be able to report that we have ceased this practice very, very quickly. So ensure you budget for the data collection for this in the early part of the behaviour support plan. Remember that you're going to need to update your BSP promptly because the reporting will need to change for the implementing providers. And remember, think about whether the budget can prioritise this fade out immediately through increase in support, increase in environmental adjustments. So when you're going to plan for fade out, you need to do the following 5 things as a priority. First of all, you need to document and communicate your intent. Remember that it is a key part of our role to ensure that the person understands and is informed about the intent to include restrictive practices and what the fade out pathway looks like for that. A number of NDIS quality and safeguards audits have focused on this, and it is an area of focus for the Commission. You need to understand your fade out objective. What are we aiming to achieve in this plan period? What is the longer term pathway for this particular restrictive practice? Again, remembering there can be some years involved in a fade out. Look at and review your risk profile. The 2024 or the 3.0 template moves into a space where we refer to behaviour in terms of risk. So, what is the escalation of the behaviour going to look like when we take the restrictive practice away? How can we manage those risks? What is the budget that we need to put into place? What are the tasks we need to put into place so that we're monitoring and being able to respond to that? We need to create a fade out pathway. So, what are each of the steps that need to look like? And collaborate with your supports. When you're not sure what that step looks like, it's very likely it's because there's another member of the support or stakeholder team that can be involved to support you. And remember to assign your tasks and timeframes to your stakeholders. Most fade out requires significant stakeholder involvement. So make sure your environmental modifications are in place. Make sure everybody is trained and on board. Make sure that you're ready to go when you begin the fade. And this might require quite significant focus in the early part of BSP implementation. So, next steps. So, the first thing to do is consider the tasks. Review your key dates for the participants' NDIS plan. Review the supports in place to assist with fade out, making sure that what you've got on board can cope with what you're planning. Then consider your timeframes. Establish your pathway to your fade out goal for this plan period. Allow for time frame and budget overrun. And then budget. Determine the time required, working backwards from your due date, and recognize the non face to face time. To continue to understand how restrictive practices interact and intersect with the work of the behaviour support practitioner, I encourage you to look at the additional resources within our microlearning library, noting here that there are a number of data collection, modification, and restrictive practices adjustments that can be really helpful. Thank you.